Peter loved Jesus. That is the place where this story has to begin. Because without understanding the depth and the sincerity of that love, everything that follows becomes simply a cautionary tale about human weakness rather than what it actually is. One of the most devastating and ultimately most redemptive stories in all of Scripture about the gap between our intentions and our capacity, and the grace that meets us in that gap. Peter was not a casual follower. He was not a man who had wandered into the orbit of Jesus out of mild curiosity and maintained a comfortable, low-commitment religious association. From the moment Jesus said, "Follow me," on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, Peter had given everything. He left his nets. He left his boat. He left the fishing business that was his livelihood and his identity and his future, and he walked away from it without apparent hesitation to follow a rabbi from Nazareth down a road that had no clear destination and no guaranteed outcome. In the years that followed, Peter had been at the center of everything. He was the one who stepped out of the boat onto the water. He was the one who spoke when others were silent, who acted when others deliberated, who led when others followed. And he was the one who at Caesarea Philippi said the words that Jesus called the foundation of the entire church. "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." That confession did not come from a man performing religious devotion. It came from a man who had spent years watching Jesus up close, watching him heal the untouchable, silence the storms, feed the thousands, confront the powerful, love the broken, and who had arrived at a conviction so deep and so personal that it became the bedrock declaration of the entire Christian movement. Peter loved Jesus, not perfectly, not wise, not with the mature, tested, refined love that would come later, after the fire had done its work, but genuinely, passionately, with the full force of a personality that did everything at full volume. And that love is exactly what makes what he said at the Last Supper so understandable and so dangerous. The evening had been heavy with things unsaid and things said that the disciples couldn't yet fully absorb. Jesus had washed their feet. He had broken bread and said, "This is my body." He had spoken of betrayal, of going away to a place they couldn't follow, of a new commandment to love one another. The atmosphere in the upper room was thick with something the disciples could feel, but couldn't name the particular weight of a night that is changing everything, even before the change has fully arrived. And then Jesus said, "All of you will fall away because of me tonight. It is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered." Peter heard this, and something in him rose up immediately. Not calculation, not careful theological weighing of the prediction. Something more instinctive than that, more immediate, more completely Peter. He said, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." And then, when Jesus told him directly that before the rooster crowed that very night, Peter would deny him 3 times, Peter doubled down with the full force of his convictions. "Even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you." Read those words carefully. Even if I have to die with you. This was not a performance. This was not Peter managing his public image in front of the other disciples. This was the sincere declaration of a man who genuinely believed what he was saying, who measured the depth of his love for Jesus and found it sufficient for anything, including death. He was not lying. He was not posturing. He was telling the truth as he understood it about himself at that moment. And that is precisely what makes this moment so spiritually significant and so personally relevant to every person watching this today. Because the most dangerous spiritual position is not the position of acknowledged weakness. It is the position of confident, sincere, completely convinced strength that has not yet been tested by the specific pressure that will reveal its actual limits. Peter's declaration, "I will never deny you," came from the deepest and most genuine place in him. and it was wrong. Not because he didn't love Jesus. He did, but because he didn't yet know what he didn't know about himself. He didn't know that the love he felt in the warm lamplight of the upper room, surrounded by his closest companions, with the emotional force of the Passover and Jesus' words carrying him, he didn't know that that love, however real, had not yet been tested by cold and isolation and fear, and the particular cowardice that visits everyone in the dark of a night when something terrifying is happening, and a servant girl is pointing at you across a courtyard fire. There is a sobering and important word here for every person who has ever said some version of Peter's declaration. I would never do that. I could never walk away from my faith. I could never abandon this commitment. I could never betray this person. Not me, maybe others, but not me. The confidence is real. The love behind it is real. And the danger embedded in it is also real. Because the moment we believe that our devotion is sufficient protection against our own weakness, we stop doing the things that actually protect us. We stop staying close enough to Jesus that his presence is the shield, rather than our own resolve. We stop paying attention to the small compromises, the incremental distances, the barely perceptible drift that begins long before the moment of dramatic failure. We trust the declaration rather than tending the relationship. And the declaration, however sincere, cannot sustain what only the relationship can sustain. Jesus did not rebuke Peter for his declaration. He didn't say that's a foolish thing to say, and you should know better. He told Peter the truth about what was coming. Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Not if you turn back. When? Jesus already knew the full arc of the story. He saw the denial coming, and he had already prayed through it, and he had already given Peter the commission that waited on the other side of it. But Peter heard none of that. He heard the prediction of failure, and he rejected it with everything he had. And a few hours later, in a cold courtyard in Jerusalem, he would discover something about himself that the lamplight of the upper room had not been able to show him. The rooster was going to crow before morning, and Peter was going to hear it, and the sound of it was going to break him open in a way that nothing else in his 3 years with Jesus had been able to do. Not the storms, not the miracles, not the transfiguration, the crow of a rooster in a courtyard where he had just heard himself say 3 times, I do not know the man. But before we get to the courtyard, we need to follow Peter out of the upper room and into the darkness of the night and watch the small, almost invisible step that began everything. The step that most of us recognize, if we are honest, from our own spiritual lives. The step that Peter himself probably didn't notice he was taking until it was far too late. He began to follow. At a distance, they came for Jesus in the garden, Judas leading them, torches and weapons in the dark, the particular ugliness of betrayal wearing the face of a friend. In the chaos that followed Peter drawing his sword, cutting off the ear of the high priest's servant, Jesus stopping him and healing the wound. Even in the moment of his own arrest, the disciples scattered. The text says they all left him and fled. All of them. Every single one. The 11 who had just hours earlier declared their willingness to die with him. They ran into the darkness, away from the torches and the soldiers and the horrifying reality of what was happening to the man they had followed for 3 years. Except Peter. Peter didn't run. Or rather, Peter ran in the wrong direction. Instead of running away from the scene, he turned and followed the group that was leading Jesus away from a distance. That word distance appears in the gospel accounts with a specificity that the original writers clearly intended to be significant. Peter followed him at a distance, not close, not open, not the way a disciple walks with his rabbi, present and identified and willing to be known as belonging to this person. At a distance, far enough back to be safe, close enough to still see what was happening. This middle position, not leaving entirely, not committing fully, is the most dangerous spiritual location available to a human being. It is the place that feels like faithfulness because you haven't technically walked away. You are still following. You are still engaged, still watching, still present in some meaningful sense. But the distance has created a gap that is already doing its work on you, already changing the chemistry of your courage, already placing you in a context where the pressures on you are no longer the pressures of someone who stands openly with Jesus, but the pressures of someone who is trying to maintain presence without identification. Peter ended up in the courtyard of the high priest. He ended up sitting by a fire with people who were not his people servants and officials of the very establishment that was at that moment, trying to destroy the person Peter had left everything to follow. He was warming himself at their fire. In the cold of a Jerusalem night, with his rabbi bound and his future unclear and his fear very real, Peter sat down in the warmth of the enemy's fire and tried to blend in. Think about the psychology of this moment with full honesty. Peter had not decided to betray Jesus. He was not sitting by that fire plotting his denials. He was doing what frightened people do, seeking warmth, seeking the comfort of presence, seeking to manage an impossible situation by finding a way to be present without being exposed. He probably told himself he was staying close to see what happened, that he was maintaining his proximity to Jesus' situation by remaining in the courtyard. He probably didn't fully notice, in the moment, how far he had already traveled from the person who had said, "I will die with you," only a few hours earlier. But the distance had done its work, and it was still doing its work, quietly, in the cold air of that Jerusalem courtyard, in every moment that passed. While Peter sat at a fire that wasn't his and tried not to be recognized. This is the pattern of almost every spiritual failure that doesn't announce itself with a dramatic moment of rebellion. It begins with distance. Not abandonment. Abandonment is at least honest about what it is. Distance is more subtle and therefore more dangerous. It is the prayer life that is shortened imperceptibly over months, until what was once a genuine conversation has become a brief formality. It is the Sunday attendance that has continued while the interior engagement has quietly withdrawn until you are still in the building, but no longer really present in the way that matters. It is the relationship with God that remains functional in its external forms, while something in the center of it has grown cool and quiet and removed from the warmth it once carried. Peter had been close to Jesus for 3 years. He had sat across from him at meals, walked beside him on dusty roads, watched him pray in the early mornings, heard him teach and argue and laugh. Closeness had been the normal condition of Peter's life as a disciple, and now, in a single night, the closeness had been replaced by distance, by the careful, fear-driven, self-protective positioning of a man who was still technically present, but was no longer willing to be identified. The fire in that courtyard was a charcoal fire. The Greek word used, anthrakion, is specific and unusual enough that the only other place it appears in the Gospel of John is on the beach in Galilee after the resurrection, where Jesus has built a charcoal fire to make breakfast for his disciples. The writer of John uses the same word deliberately, connecting these two fires across the most important days in Peter's life. The fire where he fell, the fire where he was restored. Both charcoal fires, both encounters that would define him forever. But that connection is still weeks away. Right now, Peter is huddled by the first fire, cold, afraid, at a distance that has been growing since the garden, since the moment he chose to follow from far enough back to be safe. And someone has just looked at him across the flames and recognized something about his face, his accent, his whole bearing, that he has been trying to suppress since he sat down. The woman's voice cuts through the sound of the fire. "You also were with Jesus, the Galilean." The world of that courtyard stopped, and Peter felt the first wave of a fear that had nothing to do with soldiers or swords. The particular paralyzing fear of being seen when you have been trying desperately not to be seen. The fear of being placed publicly in a category you have been working to escape. The fear that is small enough, in the cold light of what Peter had declared he was willing to face, to be almost embarrassing, and large enough in the actual moment of its arrival to produce a response that he would spend the rest of his life carrying. He opened his mouth, and the distance that had been growing since the garden completed its work. The woman's accusation was not violent. It was not delivered by a soldier with a weapon. It came from a servant girl, one of the lowest social positions available in that culture. A person with essentially no power to compel any response from Peter whatsoever. She looked at him across the fire and said, "You also were with Jesus, the Galilean." That was all it took. "I do not know what you are talking about." Peter heard himself say the words before he had fully decided to say them. That is how fear works when it has been building for hours in the cold of a courtyard fire, while the person you love is being tried inside. The decision was not fully conscious. The fear simply found a voice and used his mouth. And the first denial came out into the night air and could not be called back. He moved, physically moved away from the fire, toward the gateway, putting distance between himself and the woman who had recognized him. But he didn't leave the courtyard. He was still there, still maintaining that impossible middle position, not close enough to be identified, not far enough away to be safe from the questions. And the questions kept coming. At the gateway, another servant saw him and said to those standing nearby, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." This time the accusation was public, not a one-on-one confrontation across a fire, but a statement made to a group, requiring not just a quiet deflection, but a public response. Peter denied it again, with an oath this time. "I do not know the man." The words were getting harder. The stakes of each denial were escalating, because each denial committed him more fully to the position he had taken with the first one, and the cost of reversing course was now higher than the cost of continuing. This is how Peter descended from discomfort to full betrayal in 3 steps, not through a single decision to deny everything, but through the momentum of each small choice, making the next one more likely and more extreme. An hour passed, and then another bystander approached. This one had a specific accusation that went beyond recognition. "Certainly you are one of them, for your accent gives you away." The Galilean accent was distinctive, identifiable, the kind of audible marker that couldn't be managed away in a public courtyard, no matter how carefully you managed your face. Peter had nowhere left to go. The path of partial denial had narrowed to a single point, and at that point, the only options were full exposure or full retreat. And he chose full retreat. The text says he began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them, "I do not know the man." I do not know the man. Not, I do not know Jesus. Not, I do not know my rabbi, my teacher, my Lord. The man. The distancing is complete. The person who had said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," who had confessed the divine identity of Jesus with words that Jesus himself said came directly from the Father, that person had now reduced Jesus to the man, an anonymous figure, someone unconnected to Peter, someone Peter was willing to disown in order to stay warm by a courtyard fire, while a servant girl pointed at him. And then the rooster crowed. There is no way to read what comes next without feeling the full weight of it, because what follows the rooster's crow is one of the most devastating and most grace-filled sentences in the entire New Testament. It is a sentence so brief and so loaded that it can barely be read without something breaking open in the chest of anyone who has ever failed someone they love. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. He was being led across that courtyard, bound, under arrest, on his way to a trial whose outcome was already predetermined. In the middle of all of that, in the middle of his own arrest, his own agony, his own movement toward a cross that he had been carrying in his knowledge for years, Jesus turned and looked at Peter. Not a glance, not an accidental meeting of eyes, a look, the kind of look that sees everything, the kind of look that is known this moment was coming and has been carrying it since the upper room when he said, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." The kind of look that could only exist in a person who, in the moment of their own worst suffering, still has enough love left over to seek out the face of the person who has just, for the 3rd time in an hour, said, "I do not know the man." Peter met those eyes, and something in him broke completely. Here is the truth that the rooster and the look together reveal about the nature of real repentance, the kind that produces transformation rather than just regret. What broke Peter was not the evidence of his own failure, though that was devastating enough. What broke him was the look in Jesus' eyes, because the look was not what he deserved. The look was not the look of a person who has been betrayed and is responding with the anger and the cold withdrawal that betrayal earns. The look was, the text doesn't tell us this directly, but every reader who has sat with this passage feels it. The look was still love. That is the thing that broke Peter open. Not accusation, not punishment, not the full measure of what his betrayal had earned, but the love that was still there, unchanged, in the eyes of the man he had just said he didn't know. The love that said, "I see you. I see exactly what you just did. I see the fear and the failure and the 3 denials and the curses you called down on yourself. And I am still here, and I still love you. And I told you this was coming. And I have already prayed for you. And I am still right now in the middle of everything that is happening to me, looking for your face." Peter went outside and wept bitterly, not the weeping of a man who has been caught and is suffering the consequences of exposure, the weeping of a man whose heart has been broken open by a love he did not deserve and cannot escape and cannot fully comprehend. The weeping that is the beginning of everything that is still to come. The cross came on Friday. Jesus was crucified on a hill outside Jerusalem, while most of his disciples watched from a distance. Peter, as far as the gospel accounts tell us, was not among even the distant observers. The man who had sworn he would die with Jesus was not at the place where Jesus died. Where was Peter on Friday? The text doesn't say. We are left to imagine, based on what we know of him, who he was, what he had done, what he had seen in those eyes across the courtyard, where a man like Peter goes when the worst thing that was possible has happened, and he is entirely responsible for a portion of it. And then came Saturday. If Friday was the day of death, Saturday was the day of silence. The sealed tomb, the ended story. The disciples scattered, some of them gathered in a locked room somewhere in Jerusalem, out of fear for their own safety. Grief and terror and bewilderment, all pressing down together into the heaviest day any of them had ever lived through. For the others, Saturday was primarily grief. The teacher was dead. The one they had believed was the Messiah had been crucified like a common criminal, and all the hopes that had been building for 3 years had been sealed into a tomb with a stone too large for any of them to move. But for Peter, Saturday carried something the other disciples were not carrying. They were grieving. Peter was grieving and drowning in shame. He was carrying everything they were carrying, and he was carrying it alone because his portion of the story was not just that Jesus had died. His portion was that in the last hours of Jesus' life, Peter had looked into his eyes and denied him 3 times. And then Jesus had died. And those denials were the last thing that had passed between them. Think about what that Saturday was like in Peter's interior life. No opportunity to explain himself. No chance to say what he wanted to say because there was no conversation possible with a sealed tomb. No path to apology or repair or the kind of face-to-face accounting that might have at least put the words into the open air between them. Just the silence, the finality, the echo of his own voice saying, "I do not know the man." And then the rooster, and then the eyes, and then the cross. The story appeared to have ended in the worst possible place, with the worst possible final note between Peter and the person he loved most. This is the Saturday that millions of people are living in right now, and it has nothing to do with Jerusalem or tombs or Roman crosses. It is the Saturday of your own most significant failure, the one that feels sealed and final, the one that came after you said, "I will never," the one where the window for repair appears to have closed before you had the chance to do anything about it. It is the morning after you said the thing you cannot unsay, the day after you did the thing that cannot be undone, the season after the relationship ended in a way that left your worst self fully visible, and no opportunity to show that that version of you was not the whole story. The particular cruelty of Peter's Saturday, and of every version of it in every human life, is the way it uses the silence to confirm the shame. When there is nothing happening, when there is no voice breaking through to say anything different, the shame writes its own story in the silence. And the story it writes is always the same. This is how it ends. This is who you turned out to be. The declarations were lies, and the commitments were hollow. And when the pressure finally came, the real you showed up and said, "I do not know the man." That is the truth about you. And now it is sealed behind a stone, and there is nothing you can do about it. Peter had been a fisherman before Jesus. He had been Simon, son of Jonah, a working man with calloused hands and a boat and a fishing business, and a life that, while ordinary, was at least coherent. And then Jesus had interrupted that life and called him to something else, and Peter had gone with everything he had. And now, on this Saturday, sitting in the rubble of the worst, 24 hours of his life, it is possible to feel the pull of the old life as the only remaining option. At least he knew who he was as a fisherman. At least the nets didn't require him to be something he couldn't sustain. At least the fish didn't know what he had done. But Sunday came. The stone moved. The tomb was empty. And the story that Saturday had declared finished turned out to be a story that hadn't even reached its most important chapter yet. Mary Magdalene saw Jesus first. Then he appeared to the disciples in the locked room. Then to Thomas, specifically and personally, addressing the exact doubt that Thomas had expressed. And this is the detail that tells you everything about how Jesus conducts restoration. There was a message delivered to the women at the empty tomb. Go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. And Peter, the specific individual mention of Peter's name in that message, is one of the most tender details in all four Gospels. The message was not just for the disciples as a group, with Peter included by implication. It was for the disciples. And Peter, as if to say, "I know you, Peter. I know what Saturday was for you. I know you might be sitting in the wreckage of your failure and wondering whether the resurrection changes anything for you. Specifically, whether the grace that is flowing out of that empty tomb is also intended for the man who said 3 times that he didn't know me. So I am sending a message with your name on it. I am going before you to Galilee. Come. You especially come." Peter went to Galilee, and what he found there and what happened on a beach beside a charcoal fire is the story that the rest of this series has been building toward. The story of what Jesus does with the people who have failed him most publicly, most specifically, most completely. Not what he tolerates, not what he manages, what he does with deliberate, personal, impossibly gracious intention. He makes breakfast, and he asks a question, the same question, 3 times. precise and purposeful, and aimed straight at the exact shape of the wound. The resurrection had happened. The tomb was empty. The locked room had been visited twice by Jesus, standing in the middle of the disciples, with wounds still visible in his hands and his side, saying, "Peace be with you," in a voice they recognized completely. Thomas had seen and believed. The 40 days of post-resurrection appearances had begun, and the disciples were living inside the most disorienting and glorious stretch of time any human beings had ever experienced, the weeks between the empty tomb and the ascension, when the man they had watched die was walking around alive, eating fish, showing up through locked doors, teaching them things about the kingdom that they were only now, in the light of resurrection, beginning to understand. And Peter was there for all of it, present in the locked room, present when Thomas saw the wounds, present for the teachings and the appearances and the slow, astonishing recalibration of everything they thought they understood about what God was doing in the world. And yet, something was unfinished. Something between Peter and Jesus had not yet been addressed. The resurrection had happened, and Peter was grateful, and Peter believed, but the courtyard was still there. The charcoal fire was still burning in his memory. The 3 denials were still sitting in the space between them like something that everyone could see, but nobody had yet named out loud in a direct conversation between the two of them. Jesus had appeared to the disciples as a group. He had spoken peace over the room, but he had not yet sat down with Peter specifically and addressed what Peter knew needed to be addressed. This is a particular kind of unfinished business that every person who has failed someone they love deeply will recognize. It is the forgiveness that has been implied but not yet spoken directly into the specific wound. It is the reconciliation that is present in atmosphere but has not yet been completed in the actual conversation that the failure requires. You know that the relationship has survived, the other person is still there, still present, still engaging with you, but the specific thing has not been talked about. And until it is, there is a distance in the middle of the closeness that doesn't go away just because everyone is being gracious about not mentioning. Peter was living in that distance, and it was making him restless in a way that the resurrection, as extraordinary as it was, had not yet resolved. And so Peter did what restless men who don't know what to do with themselves tend to do. He went back to something he knew, something that predated the calling and the miracles and the declarations and the failures, something that his hands remembered before his mind decided anything. He said to the other disciples, "I am going fishing." 6 of them went with him. They got into the boat on the Sea of Galilee, the same lake where Jesus had found them years earlier, the same water on which Peter had once walked, the same familiar geography of their pre-Jesus lives. And they fished all night, and they caught nothing. The experienced fisherman, back in his natural element, with the right equipment and the right water and the right time of night, and nothing. The nets came up empty every time, hour after hour, through the whole long, dark stretch of a night that should have been productive and wasn't. There is something almost parabolic about it, as though the life Peter was attempting to return to the pre-Jesus life, the life that existed before the calling and the failing and all the complicated weight of discipleship, was no longer available to him, even on its own terms. He couldn't go back, not because Jesus wouldn't let him, but because the man who had spent 3 years following Jesus was not the same man who had once been a simple fisherman on this lake, and that man's life was no longer accessible to him, even when he tried to step back into it. As morning broke, a figure appeared on the shore. In the mist and the early light, at a distance of about 100 yards, the disciples couldn't make out who it was. The figure called out, "Children, do you have any fish?" They answered, "No." The figure said, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." They cast, and the net immediately filled with fish so full that they couldn't haul it back into the boat. 153 large fish, straining the net to its limit without breaking it. And John, who had been watching all of this, looked at the shore and looked at the net and looked at the figure standing in the early morning light. And he said to Peter the words that set everything in motion. "It is the Lord." Peter did not wait. He did not think through the logistics. He did not consider his dignity or the practicality of what he was about to do. He heard "it is the Lord," and he wrapped his outer garment around himself. The detail is oddly specific, almost comical in its very Peterness, this man taking the time to put his clothes on before jumping into the lake. And he threw himself into the water and swam 100 yards to shore. The other disciples followed in the boat, dragging the impossible net full of fish. And when they reached the shore, they found that Jesus had already built a fire, not just arrived at the shore and waited. Built a fire? There was already bread there. There were fish already cooking on the coals. He had prepared breakfast for them before they arrived. He was already feeding them before the conversation happened, before the restoration was spoken, before anything was required of Peter, except to come and receive what had been prepared. This is one of the most quietly extraordinary details in the entire resurrection narrative. Jesus could have waited until the disciples arrived and then organized breakfast as a shared activity, a practical demonstration of community and normalcy. He could have simply been present. Resurrection appearances don't require props or preparation. But he had built the fire and prepared the food before any of them reached the shore, which means the restoration that was about to happen had been prepared before Peter arrived, before Peter had done anything to earn or merit or facilitate it. The breakfast was already there. The fire was already burning. Everything needed for what was about to happen had been arranged by Jesus in advance of Peter's presence. "Come and have breakfast." That is what Jesus said. Not, "Peter, we need to talk." Not, "There's some things we need to address before we can move forward." Come and have breakfast. Eat first. Be cared for first. Receive the provision before the conversation. Let the warmth of the fire and the food I have prepared for you settle into your body before we do the harder thing. Because the harder thing is coming, and it is going to require everything you have left. But first, eat. None of the disciples asked who he was. They knew it was the Lord. And they sat down by the fire, the charcoal fire, with the same word John used for the courtyard fire. And they ate breakfast on the shore of Galilee in the early morning light, with the impossible net of fish pulled up beside them, and the risen Jesus passing them bread and fish, with the same hands that had been pierced by Roman nails less than 6 weeks before. And when they had finished eating, Jesus turned to Peter, and the conversation began. The breakfast was finished. The other disciples were present. This was not a private conversation, which matters, because the failure had not been entirely private either. The 3 denials had happened in a courtyard full of people. The restoration was about to happen in a visible, witnessed space as well. Jesus looked at Peter, and he said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Notice the name, not Peter, the name Jesus had given him, the name that meant rock, the name that carried the weight of his calling and his identity as a disciple. Simon, his birth name, his before the calling name, the name he had carried before any of this began, before the boat, and the nets, and the walking on water, and the great confession, and the Last Supper declaration, and the courtyard fire. Jesus addressed him as Simon, reaching back past everything that had happened to the person who had existed before any of it, the person beneath the disciple, the man beneath the failures and the declarations and the momentum of 3 years of following. Do you love me more than these? This question is layered with meaning that has been discussed by theologians for 2,000 years. More than these, more than the other disciples, more than the fishing equipment, the boat, the nets, the life you came back to last night. More than these things you have shown you are willing to return to when the discipleship feels too hard. The exact reference is intentionally ambiguous, which means the question is asking something larger than any single interpretation, Peter. Where does your love for me rank among all the other loves and loyalties and securities in your life? Is it the primary thing? Is it the love that holds when the other loves compete with it? And there is a second layer. More than these, this was the language Peter himself had used in the upper room. Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will. Even if all more than the others, more devoted, more certain, more committed than everyone else in the room. And Jesus is echoing that language back now, not to humiliate Peter with the memory of what that confidence had produced, but to create a space for Peter to respond to the same question from a different, more honest place. You said you loved me more than these. Now here, by this fire, on this morning, after everything that has happened, do you still make that claim? Not the confident claim of a man who hasn't been tested yet. The claim of a man who has seen exactly how his love performed under pressure, and who is now being invited to answer the question again from that place. Peter did not say, yes, more than these. He could not. The courtyard had made that particular answer impossible. He said, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. The Greek here is significant and has been much discussed. Jesus uses the word agapeo for love, the highest, most committed, most sacrificial form of love. Peter responds with phileo, a word that carries more of the warmth of personal affection, friendship, deep fondness. Some scholars read this as Peter deliberately choosing a lower register than the one Jesus used, as if to say, I cannot claim the high word anymore. I know what I did with it. All I can honestly offer you now is this, the simpler, humbler word, the love that I actually have, not the love I thought I had. Jesus said, feed my lambs. He asked a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And again used the word agapeo. And again Peter answered with phileo. And Jesus said, tend my sheep. And then he asked the third time. And this time Jesus used Peter's own word, phileo, not reaching up to the higher register, coming down to meet Peter where Peter was, coming down to the honest word, the available word, the word that represented what Peter actually had to offer rather than what he had once declared he was capable of. Do you love me with the love you've been claiming? The simpler love, the friend love, the love? That is what you have left after the courtyard and the rooster and the bitter weeping. The text says that Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? 3 questions. The same shape as 3 denials. The same number, clearly and deliberately, unmistakably, calling back the specific contours of the failure that stood between them. Jesus was not counting Peter's sins aloud. He was doing something more precise and more merciful than that. He was creating a space, question by question, for Peter to place a word of love in every place where a denial had been spoken, not to erase the denials, they were historical facts. And God does not pretend that things didn't happen, but to cover them, to answer them, to give Peter the opportunity to speak into the specific number and the specific shape of his failure, with the specific number and specific shape of his love. Peter answered the third time with everything he had, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. He was not making a new declaration of the I will never deny you variety. He was appealing to the only witness left who could testify to what was true in him, not his own certainty, which had already proven insufficient, but Jesus's knowledge. You who turned and looked at me across the courtyard. You who met my eyes after the third denial and saw whatever was there. You who knew me before I knew myself. and know me better than I know myself still. You know whether I love you. You know what is true in me better than my own declarations can say. And I am resting my answer on what you know rather than on what I can claim. Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. There is the restoration, not delivered as a formal pronouncement or a theological transaction, delivered in the form of a commission, the same commission, 3 times, in 3 slightly different forms. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. The man who had denied knowing Jesus 3 times by a fire was now given responsibility for the people. Jesus loved most the flock he had called himself the Good Shepherd to protect and provide for. 3 times, by a fire, in the precise shape of the failure he had committed. The denials had said, I do not know him. He is not mine, and I am not his. The commission said, he is yours, and you are his. And the proof of that belonging is that he is entrusting everything that belongs to him to your care, not despite what you did, through what you did on the other side of it. Jesus then said something to Peter that was simultaneously a prophecy and a gift. He told Peter that there would come a day when Peter would be old, and someone else would dress him and lead him where he did not want to go. A reference, John tells us, to the death by which Peter would glorify God. The man who had been too afraid to acknowledge knowing Jesus in a courtyard full of people was going to die rather than deny him. The love that had failed under the pressure of a servant girl's accusation was going to hold, in the end, under the pressure of martyrdom. Jesus knew this. He always knew it. He knew the courtyard was coming, and he prayed through it before it happened, and he was already on the beach, preparing breakfast before Peter arrived, because he had known all along what Peter contained, not just the failure, but the love that survived the failure and the courage that was being forged in the furnace of the shame. Follow me. Those were Jesus' final words to Peter on the beach. The same words he had spoken years earlier on this same shore when he first found Peter with his nets. Follow me. The calling had not been revoked. The purpose had not been canceled. The failure had been real, and the restoration had been real. And now, on the other side of both of them, Jesus said the same thing he had said at the beginning. Follow me. And Peter followed. 2 fires. That is the structural center of Peter's entire story. And it is worth pausing to let the full weight of that symmetry settle before we move to the final word this story has to speak. The first fire was a charcoal fire in the courtyard of the high priest. Cold night. Frightened man. Accusation from a servant girl. 3 questions, each one offering Peter an opportunity to claim his identity as a follower of Jesus. 3 denials, each one more vehement than the last. I do not know the man. Curse words and oaths and the full force of his fear driving him as far from Jesus as words could carry him, while his body remained in the same physical space. The second fire was a charcoal fire on the shore of Galilee. Dawn. Breakfast already prepared. The risen Jesus waiting patiently for his disciples to row in from a night of empty nets. 3 questions, each one offering Peter an opportunity to claim his love for Jesus. 3 affirmations, each one more desperate and honest than the last. Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. The symmetry is perfect, too perfect to be accidental. The writer of John uses the same unusual Greek word for charcoal fire in both places, a word that appears nowhere else in the New Testament precisely so that readers will make the connection. The 2 fires are meant to be understood together. The beach fire was designed by Jesus as the answer to the courtyard fire. The 3 questions were designed as the redemption of the 3 denials. The commission to feed his sheep was designed as the restoration of the man who had, by the first fire, tried to destroy his own identity as a sheep of that flock. Jesus did not forgive Peter at a distance. He did not send a message through an intermediary saying, "Your denials are forgiven, carry on." He constructed a scene deliberate, detailed, precise in every element that would allow Peter to walk back through the shape of his failure and find in the exact place where the failure had been the love and the calling that the failure had not been able to destroy. He met the specific wound with a specific healing. Not a general pronouncement of grace, but a targeted, personal, wound-shaped act of restoration that addressed the exact contours of the damage. This is how Jesus restores people. Not by glossing over the failure as though it didn't happen. Not by pretending the wound doesn't exist and moving forward as though everything is fine, but by going directly to the wound, by asking the question that lands exactly in the sore place, by creating the space for the truth to be spoken into the specific location where the damage was done, and then speaking a word of love and commission into that specific place that is larger than the damage and more permanent than the failure. 3 denials, 3 affirmations. The math is not incidental. The accounting is precise. And the precision is not punitive. Jesus is not making Peter count his failures or perform a proportional act of contrition for every sin committed. The precision is restorative. He is making sure that there is no cavity left unfilled, no denial left unanswered, no place where the echo of "I do not know the man" continues to ring without being covered by a word of honest, hard-won, post-failure love. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep. Feed my sheep. 3 times the commission, 3 times the entrusting. The man who denied is given the flock of the man he denied. This is the final measure of the restoration, not that Peter is permitted to return to his previous position, but that he is given a greater responsibility than he held before. He is not reinstated as a junior disciple learning the ropes. He is given the pastoral care of the entire flock of God. The failure that should have disqualified him has become, through the grace of these 3 questions and these 3 answers, the very experience that makes him capable of the shepherding he is now commissioned to do. Because Peter now knows what he did not know in the upper room. He knows what it feels like to be the one who said, "I will never," and then did the thing he said he would never do. He knows the cold of the courtyard fire, and the sound of the rooster, and the look in Jesus' eyes, and the bitter weeping outside the gate. He knows the Saturday of shame and the restlessness of a resurrection that hadn't yet addressed the specific failure. He knows the weight of unfinished business between himself and the person he loves most. He knows all of this now in his body, in his memory, in the deepest places of his experience. And that knowledge, hard-won, shame-purchased, failure-forged knowledge, is exactly what will make him the shepherd that the broken, the fallen, the ashamed, the "I will never" people of every generation will need. He will preach in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, and 3,000 people will be added to the church in a single day. He will heal the lame man at the beautiful gate, and the name of Jesus will spread through the city. He will stand before the Sanhedrin, the same religious establishment in whose courtyard he had denied Jesus, and say we must obey God rather than human beings. He will carry the gospel to places and people that would never have received it without the particular combination of boldness and brokenness and hard-won grace that only a man who has been to the courtyard and the beach fire can carry. The failure was real. The restoration was real. And the man who emerged from the beach fire was not the same man who had sat in the upper room with his chest forward, declaring that he would die rather than deny. He was better, not because the failure had made him stronger in some easy, linear way, but because the failure had made him honest about himself, about the limits of his own resolve, about the source of anything. he would ever do that was genuinely worth doing. He knew now, in a way that could never be argued away, that whatever he accomplished in the years ahead would not be the product of Simon, son of John's considerable personal courage and determination. It would be the product of the Jesus who had turned and looked at him across the courtyard and still loved him, who had built the breakfast fire before he arrived and waited for him on the shore, who had asked 3 questions and accepted 3 answers and said, "Feed my sheep," with the full knowledge of everything that had come before. "Follow me." Jesus had said it on the shore by the nets 3 years earlier. He said it again on the shore by the breakfast fire, with everything that had happened in between fully acknowledged and fully addressed and fully redeemed. Follow me. The calling was not a reward for good performance. It never had been. It was simply the invitation of a God who loved Peter on the best day of his discipleship and loved him on the worst day of it, and loved him on the morning of the beach fire with the same completeness that made the first "follow me" possible. Peter followed, and the world was changed because he did. The beach fire has been cold for 2,000 years. Peter has been gone for 2,000 years. Tradition tells us that he died exactly as Jesus predicted, crucified upside down in Rome, choosing that particular position out of the conviction that he was not worthy to die in the same manner as the one he had once denied and had spent the rest of his life serving. The man who was too afraid to acknowledge knowing Jesus in front of a servant girl died rather than deny him in front of an empire. But the question Jesus asked on that beach has not grown old. It has not become historical. It is not contained in the past tense of a story that ended in the 1st century. "Do you love me" is the most personal, most direct, most currently alive question that Jesus asked. And he is asking it now. He is asking it in this moment. He is asking it to the specific person watching this who has spent time, possibly a lot of time, in the courtyard. You know if you have been in the courtyard, maybe not in the dramatic public way that Peter was. Maybe your denials have been quieter than his. The cross necklace removed before the work presentation. The faith convictions swallowed at the dinner table when the conversation turned in that direction. The Jesus you keep out of certain conversations in certain contexts because the social cost of including him feels too high in those particular rooms. Maybe they have been more internal than external, the slow withdrawal of genuine engagement with God that has left you still present in the religious forms, while the living relationship has quietly moved toward Peter's safe distance without you fully deciding to go there. Or maybe they have been exactly as dramatic and public as Peter's. Maybe there is a specific failure, a specific moment, a specific way that you said, "I do not know the man." Not in those words, but in the language of actions and choices and the life you actually lived versus the life you declared you would live, that is sitting in the space between you and God like an unanswered conversation. Something that has made you feel with the particular heavy logic of shame that the ground between you and Jesus has been poisoned beyond what grace can reach, that you have moved too far, failed too publicly, denied too completely, to be the person Jesus still calls by name and commissions to feed his sheep. If that is where you are, then everything the beach fire says to you is this: he is already there. He was on the shore before you arrived. The breakfast fire was built before you pulled the boat to the shore. Everything needed for the restoration has been prepared by him in advance of your arrival. All that is required of you is the same thing that was required of Peter. Get out of the boat, swim to shore, sit down at the fire he has built for you, eat what he has prepared, and then answer the question honestly from whatever place you're actually in, without the declarations you made before the courtyard, and without the shame that has been writing your story since. Do you love me? Not do you love me as much as you claimed you did. Not do you love me more than everyone else in the room. Not do you love me with the high theological, all conditions included word that you once thought you were capable of. Just do you love me from where you are right now, with what you have left, with the honest post-courtyard, post-rooster, post-weeping bitterly love that knows its own limits and brings them to the fire anyway. Yes, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. That is enough. It has always been enough. It was enough on the beach in Galilee, and it is enough today on whatever shore you are standing on, in whatever form your courtyard took, in whatever way. The rooster crow of recognition the moment you heard yourself as you actually were, arrived, and shattered the comfortable distance you had been maintaining. Because here is what Jesus never said to Peter on that beach. He never said, now we need to talk about what you did. He never said, before we go any further, let's establish that you understand the full weight of the failure and have adequately accounted for it. He never said you'll be on probation for a while as we rebuild the trust. He said, do you love me? And then he said, feed my sheep. And then he said, follow me. The restoration moved directly from the love to the commission, because the love was the only thing that was ever required, not performance, not penance, not a period of demonstrated trustworthiness. The love, given honestly, offered humbly, and received completely. There is something here for every person who has been sitting in the shame of their failure, waiting for the right moment to return. Waiting until they have sufficiently recovered their spiritual credibility, until they have demonstrated enough consistent goodness to outweigh the specific badness they are carrying, until the gap between who they failed to be and who they are now is large enough to justify stepping back toward the fire they walked away from. The right moment is not coming. It is already here. It was here before you arrived. It was here while you were still in the boat, pulling empty nets in from the dark water, trying to go back to the life that existed before the calling. The fire was built. The breakfast was prepared. And Jesus is standing on the shore of your particular Galilee, asking the same question he asked the man who swam 100 yards through cold water to get to him. Do you love me? The 3 denials are not the end of your story. They are not even the most important part of your story. The most important part of your story is what happens next on the morning when you finally stop trying to manage the distance and throw yourself into the water and swim toward the fire that is already burning for you on the shore. Peter went on to preach the first sermon of the Christian church. 3,000 people. One day. The man who said, I do not know. The man stood up in Jerusalem and declared him Lord and Christ, with a boldness that the religious authorities found astonishing and could not explain except by noting that this man had been with Jesus, that he had been with Jesus before, that he had been with Jesus on the beach, that something had happened by a charcoal fire in the early morning on the shore of Galilee that had made this man into something that neither the courtyard failure nor the years of discipleship before it had been able to produce. He had been broken and restored. He had been emptied of his own self-confidence and filled with something he had received rather than generated. He had heard his own worst failure named directly and loved back into his calling through it and commissioned to the most important work of his life on the other side of it. And the Peter who fed the sheep for the rest of his days was the Peter who had been to the courtyard and the beach fire, not despite the courtyard, but through it. Your failure is not the end. It is not even the end of the chapter. It may be the beginning of the most important work of your life, the formation of the exact quality of brokenness and honesty and hard-won grace that will make you capable of feeding the sheep that are waiting for the shepherd who has actually been to the courtyard and come back. He is on the shore. The fire is already burning. The breakfast is already prepared. Do you love me? Come and find out what he does with yes.